So, I want to talk to you today about prank phone calls. When I was in elementary school, I had this friend. His name was Christopher, and I think I've talked about him before because he was my friend who my mom called my bad influence friend. He was my friend who he was the friend that my mom was kind of frustrated at. He was the friend who, when I was like 7 years old, I went over to his house and I watched Jurassic Park when I knew that I should not have watched a movie that violent. And he was like, "Bro, you gotta watch this movie. It's crazy. There's dinosaurs." And I was like, "Let's do it, man." And then it traumatized me for like 10 years of my life. So it was not a good time. But another one of Christopher's shenanigans was he came to me one time at school and he was just like, "Bro, I discovered something new. Something crazy." And I'm like, "What is it? You got to tell me." And he was just like, "It's called the prank phone call." Of course, I'm changing his language from fifth grader to adult. He's like, "It's prank phone call. You got to do this. Basically, all you do is you go on your parents' phone when they're not around, when they're not at home. You dial a random number, and then you just say silly stuff, and then you hang up." It's just hilarious time. Now, some of you who are not millennial, some of you who are, alpha people, you're just like, wait, your parents' phone? Yeah, I'm talking about a landline. How many of you guys know what a landline even is? Okay, there are far too few hands being raised. Okay, so back in the day, there used to be a thing called a landline. It was a phone that was in your house. It was plugged into the wall, like the old internet. And that's how we made calls back then. And so I remember I'm like, "Oh, snap. I'm going to do it. I'm going to try it." So lo and behold, I go into my house. I find a moment when my parents are not around. And what I knew was I had to be sneaky because I didn't want to get caught. So what I knew was my parents had a phone upstairs, but then my dad had his phone downstairs in his office, which I was just like, "Bro, this is the one," because he's not always down in there. So I waited for a time when he wasn't in there, whatever. They were both upstairs in the room doing something else, and I crept down the stairs. And I made it into his office, pick up the phone, I dial some random number, I call, and I said something to the effect, well, actually I won't repeat it, it was inappropriate. It involved bodily anatomy. I was like 12, so don't judge me too hard. But I said something inappropriate, and then I hung up the phone. To my horror, the number immediately calls back. Now, see, I did not have a concept when I was 12 of a little thing called caller ID, which existed. And so this lady calls back, and she says, "Excuse me, are you the one who just called?" And I was just like, "Yeah," because that's what I sounded like when I was that age. And she was like, "What you just said to me was extremely inappropriate. Can you please put the phone on with your parent, please?" And when you're that age, when you're a kid, that it's like when another adult says, "Go get your parent," even if you're going to get in trouble, you're just like, "Yup." So you just do it. So I just did it. Looking back, I could have just said, "Sure," and then hung up again, but I didn't. I wasn't that crafty yet. And so, I don't know why I just said yet. Yeah, I'm a little crafty. So I gave the phone to my dad. He talked to her. She explained what had happened. And all the while, I run to my room, and I'm just sitting there. I'm just like, "Oh, snap, the hammer is about to fall." So my dad calls my brother and I up. And my brother's 2 years younger than me, so he must have been 10 or 9 at the time. And he calls us up, and he has a serious conversation with us. Sits us down on the couch. He said, "Somebody made a phone call and said something inappropriate to this lady who called me back. And I'm wondering if you would just confess. Who was it? And because this is just unacceptable. This cannot happen." And me, see, I know I said a second ago I wasn't crafty, but I lied. I was crafty. So at the time, when he said that, I was like, my immediate reaction was just to play total dubious innocent. I was like, "Oh no, who could have done such a terrible thing?" And he was just like, "Anthony, do you know anything about this?" I was like, "No, why would I? I don't even know what that is, what that person said. Why would I say that?" And I was like, I look at my brother's name is Andrew. I'm like, "Andrew, do you know?" And he's like, "No, I don't know what you're talking about." I'm like, "Okay, see, exactly, none of us were innocent." And so my dad's like, "Okay, you're both grounded for 2 months. And I was like, "What do you mean?" I had the audacity to be angry. I was like, "What do you mean, grounded for 2 months?" He was like, "Yep, no TV, no computer, no Game Boy games, whatever. You got to come home, do your homework, go to bed," which is like an 11-year-old's nightmare, right? Come home, do your homework, go to bed. That's like the end of your life. So I was just like up in arms. And he's like, all right, well, do you have something you want to say? And I was like, no, because it wasn't me. And he was like, okay, you're still grounded for 2 months. So, thus began 2 months, 2 of the hardest months of my 11-year-old life. I'm going to tell you the end of that story at the end. So, I bring up this story, though, to tell you, y'all ever just been caught? You know what I'm talking about. Every now and then, sometimes in your life, you're just caught. You're caught red-handed. And this was a moment for me where I found myself just straight up caught, where I had done something wrong, and I knew I'd done something wrong, and I was caught in the act of doing something wrong, but because I was too afraid of the consequences, because I was afraid, I did not come clean. I did not come forward. And so I looked my father dead in the eyes, and I just lied, because it was a little bit easier. Because there's something difficult for us about being just caught. It exposes us, right? It tears aside all the pretenses, all of the walls. There's no more lies. There's nothing to hide behind. You're just exposed for what you really are. I want to talk about a character today who experienced being caught. I want to read a verse for you. This is John chapter 8. It goes like this. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And placing her in the middle, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say we do? There's a lot going on here. This is a story that's been told often in church. And for the sake of today, on the time we have today, I want to break up this story into 2 main things that I believe Jesus is trying to teach us here. Now, if you recall, those of you who are visiting, you may not know, we're actually in a series called Am I Cooked? It's all about a series about mistakes and redemption, how God redeems our worst mistakes. And we're tracing throughout the Bible different characters who made mistakes and how God redeemed them, just like he redeems us. So, here's the question for us today. How does God redeem the story of the woman caught in adultery? Well, I believe this story is speaking 2 parallel messages, and Jesus is teaching us 2 things. One is for the Pharisees, and one is for the woman. And I believe it speaks a word not only to the Pharisees of the time and to the woman in the situation, but it speaks a word to us as well. Because in every church, we have a little bit of both. And sometimes there's even a little bit of both in every one of us. A little bit of us who are the ones who are wanting to throw the stones, and a little bit of us who have been caught. So, we're going to dive in. But before we do, just a quick reminder with this story. This is a heavy story. And I just want to remind, because I got some bread for you today. We're going to dive in. But I feel like I need to say this one more time. I've said this before. I think it's important that we remember. Jesus never weaponizes shame as a motivation for us to change. He's never using shame to make us feel a guilt trip so that we become different. He loves us, and his love is transformative, and it changes us. It creates in us the motivation to change and to grow. But he's not out here guilt-tripping, condemning, as we know. And that's not the intention of this sermon either, even though perhaps it may seem like that, because I'm not going to lie, we're going to go hard for a couple minutes. So here we go. First of all, to the Pharisees. The story continues. Jesus hears what the Pharisees say to him. The law says this woman should be stoned for what she was caught doing. What do you say, Rabbi? It's a common thing, right, for different rabbis to test one another in this time and in this area. In this culture, they come to each other with questions about the law, things like that. What do you say, they say to Jesus, because they're trying to trap him. And so Jesus does what Jesus does. He does something silly. He kneels down and starts writing in the sand. And then he stands up and he says these words, "Whoever has not sinned, cast the first stone. He who has not sinned, cast the first stone." And something interesting begins to happen. One by one, they begin to turn around and walk away. And what's interesting is the text says that beginning with the oldest of them, they began to turn around and walk away. Now, it's an interesting phenomenon. Some scholars believe perhaps Jesus was writing the sins of the Pharisees in the sand. So I'm going to trace that. Let's trace that. If that's the case, it feels kind of good to see, these guys get wrecked in this moment, right, as we're reading. It feels you feel a little bit of righteous justice, right? And why is that? Well, of course, we know that in this time period, in this place, in this culture, this is a predominantly patriarchal society, right? The men had all the power in the society, right? This is the time and the place. And so for us reading, we see what's going on, how they take this woman and they find her caught in adultery, but in a society where a woman can't really say no to a man. Adultery is an interesting word to use. We might use another harsher word for something like this. And so it feels good for us as we read, as we say, oh man, there's a sense of righteous justice. Jesus is getting them. He's wrecking these guys as he's exposing them to the world for who they are. But then there's a deeper question. What's going on here? Does Jesus do that to us? Does he expose our sins to the world? I don't know if it feels on brand for Jesus to expose people like that. You don't really find him often doing that. With the Pharisees, at times, he makes exceptions, and he will be extremely harsh. But what is going on here? I wonder, and I might submit to you, that could it be that Jesus is breaking a hierarchy that we have, that we love to make in spaces of church and religion, between private and public sin? Because Jesus knows. He knows our tendency is to rank sin based on the private and public nature of it. It's so much easier when someone has a sin that's visible and we can see it in the community to say, look at you. It's a little bit harder for that same person, for us to know that same person goes home and they're just struggling with greed every day of their life. They can't get enough. And so, I think Jesus knows. I think Jesus knows that we rank and we feel, those of us with private sin, we feel the audacity. We feel better than people with public sin. We feel like somehow we're more qualified. We feel like somehow we get to then judge because our sin is private, because it's secret, because it's in the dark, because it's behind closed doors. And so Jesus says, well, let's just even the playing field. Her sin is out for all to see. What if your sins were also out for all to see? So they turn around. You know what I find interesting is there are some sins on a list in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, right? We have sexual immorality, drunkenness, orgies, slander, like this whole list in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And some of those sins, often in church, we say, if you are an active participant in these sins, you cannot participate in leading church or being up front. But on that same list is pride and greed. And so, to me, I think Jesus is just exposing us for who we often tend to be. That often, when a sin is public, we hold it up to a microscope, but when it's private, kind of slide it off to the side. And so he writes their sins in the sand, and realizing that they are the same as her, they flee. It reminds me of something I heard recently. A pastor was speaking. He was speaking on the Lord's Prayer. You know, there's a part in the Lord's Prayer right at the beginning, right? How does the Lord's Prayer start? Our Father who art in heaven, right? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. Padre nuestro que estás en los cielos, santificado sea tu nombre. Aprendiendo. Yes, Alan, sí. I'm trying, despacio, por favor. So, our Father who art in heaven, it's the very beginning, right? What he said, this shook me. He said this. He said, this first word is the most important word in the Lord's Prayer. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? How? Why? He said, here's the reason why. We don't get to choose who says our. We don't get to choose. It strips away our ability to delineate and to create mechanisms to prevent certain people from saying, our Father, my Father, who art in heaven. It's so hard. That's hard for us because we want to control the our. It's so difficult for us. I'm going to use an example. We're going to get political real quick because we just had an election and times are a little wild right now for us in this country, right? I have been hearing a phrase a lot, whether it's online, in person. I've heard it both online, in person, whatever. Here's the phrase. I've heard this multiple times, spoken by people I know and don't know. If you voted for X person, you cannot actually be a Christian. And I have just thought, I've heard that multiple times, and I have just thought, there is a legitimate conversation, words are hard, a legitimate conversation to be had about what we value and what we vote for, things like that. But to simply judge a whole swath of a person, to simply say that someone's heart, to simply judge the motivation of someone's heart based on who they voted for, I just can't help but feel like, really, is that really what we're called to be? Is that really who we're called to be in the world? Because I seem to recall in John chapter 17, just 10, 11 chapters after this story, Jesus says a specific text. He's praying that we as a body of believers would be one, as my Father in heaven would be one, and that the world may believe you have sent me because of their oneness. And I really believe, I just need to preach for a second. I really believe that this is one of the single greatest testimonies that the church can do in our modern world today. That when the rest of the world is polarized, when the rest of the world says, because you voted for that person, I intrinsically hate you. When the rest of the world says, you're canceled because you believe in this, because you voted for this person, that the body of Christ would actually say, I refuse to cancel this person unless they're committing harm to me or someone else, right? That's a different conversation. But I refuse to cancel someone just because of something that they may genuinely believe and that they've come to understand. That this is extremely countercultural in our current time and our current moment. Right? We live in a culture that is ready to just cut someone out of their life with a sword for believing certain things. Now, of course, as we've talked about before, and we're going to get to as well, when someone is victimized, when someone is harmed, that's a different conversation. You can still love someone and have boundaries in your life. You can still love someone and say, hey, I love you, but for the safety of myself or my family, you can't be at family gatherings. We can't have conversations. I can still love you and still forgive you. We talk on the phone. We can create mechanisms. But I really think this is so important because I think Jesus knows our tendencies and he's taken our power away to exclude the other. It's like he's speaking a word. I'm the king. I decide who's in the kingdom, not you. It's a little convicting for me. So that's for the Pharisees. But to the woman now, says, he goes on. The story goes on. It says, Jesus stood up and said to her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? Another version says, where are your accusers? And she said, no one, Lord. And Jesus said, neither do I condemn you. From now, go and sin no more. Now, there is some speculation by scholars that perhaps, we don't know this in the text because it does not blatantly say this, but perhaps the woman in this story was none other than a familiar character that we've heard of before in other places of the Gospels, Mary Magdalene. Perhaps. So let's trace that thread, if this is the case. In Luke chapter 10, we find a story where Jesus is at Mary and Martha's house, right? We all know the story. We have Mary and Martha. They're operating in two different ways. Mary is seated at Jesus' feet, listening to his teaching, and Martha is going around. She's serving others. She's making the food. And we find this interesting dichotomy that's happening because Martha's really anxious and frustrated, and she comes to Jesus and she says, why won't you make her come and help me? Because I'm working really hard to serve. And Jesus actually says, Mary has chosen the better thing. He doesn't condemn Martha for what she's doing. Her heart it seems like it's right. But he says, Mary's actually chosen the better option. What is happening here? I really believe that Jesus is getting at, there are two main trajectories in religion that we tend to fall into. One is serving and the other is sitting. And some of us are servers and some of us are sitters. And by sitters, I mean being seated at Jesus' feet, right? Here we find Mary and Martha, they are exemplars of these two trajectories. Some of us, we find ourselves like Mary, seated at Jesus' feet. We're loving worship. We love to be in worship. Maybe it's playing music or we're listening or we love to journal. We love to have devotional time, conversations, spiritual conversations, things like that. But then there are those like Martha, who's a server. Martha wants to go on a mission trip. Martha wants to help out in the kitchen at church. Martha's the person baking the pie, your favorite pie. That's the most delicious pie you've had. That's what these are, right? And so we find these two dichotomies. And Richard Rohr, he has a book where he talks about, he kind of exemplifies what I think this is getting at. He says, there are two utterly different forms of religion. One believes God will love me if I change. The other believes God loves me so that I can change. Right, so this is the difference between the two. Because the tendency of the servers is to fall into the second type of thinking. That I'm serving in order to earn something, in order to gather something. I'm serving in order that God can actually love me in return. But there's also a tendency for the sitters, like Mary. I want to read this verse one more time when Jesus says, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord," she says. And Jesus says, "Neither do I." And then he says something really important at the end. Go and sin no more. Go and sin no more. So again, we must circle back. This is difficult. This is a hard story. This is complex because, right, this is a woman in a culture and society where saying no to a man even a man who wanted to have an affair with you was very difficult. In fact, in Jewish culture and society at this time, in the law, in the legal code, there were actually legal reasons why men could have legal affairs on their wives. And so because of this, it was actually very allowed for men. But what's interesting, there was a double standard in the cultural law at the time. Women could not have affairs on their husbands, but men could have affairs on their wives. So we have this interesting double standard here, where saying no to a man who wanted to have an affair was very difficult for a woman. Right? So this woman is perhaps it's Mary, is blatantly the vulnerable party here, right? She had zero to no agency most of the time in this scenario. And so we have to ask, what is Jesus getting at? Why does he say, go and sin no more? If she's a victim, she's totally victimized, why does he use the word sin? And why does he say no more, as if to indicate she had been engaged in sin? If she's totally a victim. Now again, this is difficult, so follow me. We know that Jesus knows that women are vulnerable in this culture. Why do we know that? We know this because when he's talking about divorce, when he's asked about divorce, he brings up the fact that what men in this culture used to do was if they would marry a woman, if they didn't like her right after getting married, a week, a month, a year, whatever, they could just divorce her for no reason and just get rid of her. And then in this culture, if a woman was not attached to the household of a man, she'd be thrown out onto the street. She'd have to resort to perhaps selling herself, something like that, right? And so Jesus knows women are the vulnerable party. So he's not ambiguous, oblivious, right? Ambivalent to this fact in this culture. So if he knows, this is our question, if he knows that women are vulnerable, why does he say this? If he knows. I think perhaps Jesus is teaching us to separate sin from condemnation. Now, this is really kind of a nuanced thing, but perhaps he's teaching us something can be sin, and God is not here to condemn it. Interesting. That sounds almost antithetical to God. But it seems like what he's trying to help us understand is you can be legitimately victimized by someone else, and because of that victimization, it leads to you then sinning. And you were legitimately victimized. It was an actual victimhood that happened. It's not dismissing that. But then the behaviors that you engage in after being victimized are also sin. And Jesus comes alongside and says, I don't have condemnation for that, but it's still sin. It's still destructive to you. It's still hurting you. It's still causing you pain. There's still darkness that it's creating in your life and death. Right. Now, again, this is complex because it's really important to me that we don't feel like we are shaming victims in this space. That's really, really crucial to me. But it's also important for us to hear what Jesus is saying, right? And we know that from research, this is true. There's a study done in 2020 by Amanda Giordano where she found that if you had participated or you were subjected to 4 different types of either early childhood or even later trauma in your life, that you are 3 times more likely to engage in risk-taking behaviors, substance abuse, drug addiction, right? So these things are real. Victimhood creates real pain in us, and then from the real pain, oftentimes we react in behaviors that are destructive. But I think Jesus is teaching us a truth that we really need to hear. That he sees, if you have experienced victimhood, that he sees you, that he knows it. And he also sees the ways in which perhaps you are coping. Perhaps you've engaged in behaviors they kind of put a Band-Aid on the pain, but in the end, they're just kind of eating away at you like a cancer. And there's not condemnation for it. That's the thing that it's so difficult for us. We feel like, well, I'm engaging, life is really hard right now, so I had a few beers, maybe more than I should have. It's so hard for us in church because we're saying, okay, the Bible says drunkenness is a sin. So therefore, that was a sin what you did. There's condemnation for what you did. And Jesus says, stop, you went. There's not condemnation for it because I see the way you were victimized. I see what happened. But it's still sin. And it's a difficult delineation. But I think Jesus is helping us grow. I think the story of Mary and Martha, it teaches us that we need different things, really. What Martha needed was to sit a little bit, to just rest, to be seated at Jesus' feet and be reminded that I'm loved not because of what I do, not because of how much I serve, but because of who God is, because of who I am, that I'm a daughter. But Mary needed to learn something else. Mary needed to learn that it's time to grow, that it's time to grow. And perhaps the woman caught in adultery, if it was Mary, she needed to learn that it's time to grow, that God wanted better. And I think this is so important because some of us, and I'm going to keep it real, some of us are caught in cycles of sin and destructive behavior in our life. I can say that because I have been there, because I was the person who was caught in cycles of destructive behavior in previous times of my life. But Jesus says it's time to grow. It's not a word of condemnation, but it's time to grow. You've been in the dark for a while, but it's time to grow. I want to read this quote and then end. So I've gone a little long today, but I think it's really, really important because some of us have been harboring pain, very real pain, from real victimization that actually happened. And sometimes in church, we get the message that God only has condemnation for the behavior, but not empathy for the pain. And here we see that Jesus sees. He sees her. He knows that she's a victim in all of this. I want to read this quote. This is by N.T. Wright. It's a little long, but I think it gets at what we're getting at. Sin is not simply the breaking of a law. It is the missing of an opportunity. Having heard the echoes of a voice, we are called to come and meet the speaker. We are invited to be transformed by the voice itself, the word of the gospel, the word which declares that evil has been judged, that the world has been put to rights, that heaven and earth are joined forever, and that new creation has begun. We are called to become people who can speak and live and paint and sing that word so that those who have heard its gift, its echoes, can come and lend a hand to the larger project. That is the opportunity that stands before us as a gift and a possibility. Christian holiness is not, as people often imagine, a matter of denying something good. It's about growing up and grasping something even better. I have in my hand here a rock. I got this by the train tracks out by my house. And it's a little bit smaller than the rocks that they would have gathered to stone this woman caught in adultery. Usually in that culture, the stones were like huge. They were like almost like mini boulders, and then you would lift them over your head and you would throw them like this. But I think it exemplifies something that we see happening. I think Jesus' word through this story was a word for this time, and it's a word for us. That some of us have been like the Pharisees, casting stones at others. Some of us have thought that because our sin is secret or behind closed doors, it gives us the right to condemn someone whose sin is not. And then on the other hand, Some of us have been in the position where we are the ones on the ground. And what I've learned throughout my life is that the person holding the stone with the greatest power to make me feel condemned is me. No matter what other people say, really in my heart, it's me. And so Jesus comes in this moment to tell us, no matter which one you are, whether you've been holding stones over others or whether you've been holding a stone over yourself, that it's time to drop the stone. It's time to let it go, because he has no condemnation. Remember when I got my brother grounded for 2 months? I told him about 9 years later. We were in high school, I think I was a senior, and I was just like, bro, I need to tell you something. This has been eating me alive for years. And he was like, okay. I was like, remember that time that Dad grounded us for like 2 months? For like that prank? He's like, oh yeah, it was like, he thought that we called this lady and said something. He was like, yeah, it was really dumb. Like, we were grounded for 2 months. I was like, I did that. And his eyes like narrowed. He was just like, no, you didn't. And I was like, yeah, I did. And this whole time, all these years, I was feeling like you just hated me because you knew that secretly. You knew that secretly I was the one. And you know what he said to me? He said, to be honest, I completely forgot about it. And isn't God the same way? Amen.